Hello, and welcome to LizCapism. We're block printing fabric today, and because this is part of my medieval Kirtle project, we have a research technique to talk about too. Along with this historical craft, we'll talk about how to use pictures as a way to study historical fashion. First, a huge thank you to Catherine, who has been a patron for a while but recently upgraded to the Mary Shelley tier and gets a verbal shout out. You might remember Catherine from the excellent Hogswatch card I featured in December. Thanks, Catherine. You're awesome. Block printing is a process of carving a stamp and using it to print patterns on fabric or paper. Evidence of this technique dates back 2 millennia at least. It has been found in excavations from North Africa to China. One of the most enduring practices of block printing on fabric is sanganeri, which is a magnificent printing style from Rajasthan, which is still produced today. Printing styles like these are the most likely inspiration for European textile manufacturers who adopted the practice between the 12th and 13th centuries. Here's the block printing process. If you cannot draw, find an image you would like to copy. Make sure that you have the right to do so. My goal was to achieve something between damask patterning and heraldic blazons, so I used this stencil which I bought in a package from a craft store last year. Transfer the image to the woodblock, linoleum sheet, or rubber mat that you will be using. Remember at this stage that you will be carving the area that you don't want to get ink on. The general accepted method is to transfer in negative, so darkening the areas that you want to remove. This method makes it much easier to see what you have left to do. So instead of using my chosen stencil as a stencil, I inked the back side of it and transferred that ink onto the lino. Another method that I have used before is tracing with graphite paper. I made 3 of these templates. I wanted an opportunity to make mistakes and not have to dirty up my ink roller again. Set up a safe carving space. Carving lino and wood blocks requires a decent amount of pressure. You want that pressure moving away from your body, because no one likes stabbing themselves with carving tools. But that pressure needs something to brace against. Otherwise, our natural instinct is to use our hands. Also not safe. There is a device that you can buy to serve this purpose, but I don't have one. I used this shelf from my closet, which has a sturdy lip, and braced it with clamps to my table. Clamping the lino sheet itself limits your ability to rotate and manipulate the block. That means that you will have to use positions, again, which are dangerous. Keep the block mobile, but give it something to brace against while you carve. Carving around the edges of your design first, and then scooping the larger between portions is the advice that I have heard most often, so that's what I did. This is a lovely meditative process, I gotta say. I just turned on some music and went to town. While I carved this lovely little floral motif, let's talk about images and their usefulness in costuming research. Reading is great. I love reading. I make spreadsheets to track my reading. Regardless of my predilection for words, I thrive when I combined reading with visual learning. Not only are images useful for individual projects, you can use extant garments and diagrams as references, for example, but you can also use images to study historical fashion more broadly. Let's talk about how and where you can do this. Museums and other historical institutions. I probably sound like the most egregious broken record, but check out museum websites. Rijksmuseum, the Met, the V&A, the Kyoto Costume Institute, and etc. have extensive online collections. The best part is that while not infallible, they're pretty reliable resources. They usually list dates, provenance, fiber content, and etc. The V&A has a series of books entitled Blank Fashion in Detail. These books are pricey, so look for them at your local library. But if you can get your hands on them, they are a catalog of exquisitely photographed extant garments. But instead of the whole garment, they feature close-up shots of parts of the garment. I cannot recommend these highly enough for studying eras whose unique features are smaller and harder to see on large images. Social media. We all give social media a hard time, and rightly so. There's lots of social media that is a kind of social and economic nightmare. But there are hundreds of blogs and Instagram accounts whose entire content stream is images of historical clothing. When I first started getting interested in historical costuming, Instagram was my best friend. I would use my feed like flashcards to quiz myself. I would see a picture and try to work out the era before looking at the caption. If I got it wrong, I would try to figure out the difference between my guessed era and the real one. It was astonishing how quickly this improved my ability to distinguish decades of the 19th century, for instance. Pinterest is another one that gets a lot of flack, and it's definitely not where you want to go for accuracy in dating or sourcing. but what I have found useful on Pinterest are images of progressions of style in historical eras. Those are a great way to get a general impression of decades or centuries in fashion. And, as always, with any social media images of anything, make sure to read the captions and hover text, and, if possible, try to check the source. When I was satisfied with my carving, I cut the stamp out from the main block and glued it to a flat scrap of wood. Doesn't everybody have industrial adhesive and scrap lumber just in their house? No? Just me? Alright. This is to keep the stamp from curling or bending as you use it and giving an uneven transfer. I had to wait 24 hours for the adhesive to dry, but I didn't want the clamp holding it in place to harm or distort the stamp. So I placed a second flat wood block on top, sandwiching the stamp, and clamped that instead. Documentaries. If you need a little bit of personal guidance or interpretation with your visual learning, documentaries might be right up your alley. See what is available on your preferred topic or era on YouTube or your streaming service of choice. There are loads. I'll link some of my favorites below. Historical films, not period dramas. For fashion of the 20th century, films can be a great choice. Films that are set in the present, whenever that was, depict a kind of hyper-polished lens on contemporary fashion. Despite the fact that these are costumes and therefore carefully cultivated by a team, and you're not going to see exact replicas of reality, these costumes would have been convincing enough for a contemporary audience. So, an excellent reference nonetheless.
I got rid of all those reporters.
What'd you tell them?
Told them we were out of scotch.
What a gruesome thought.
Family photos and home movies. Now, if your nan has a crate full of slides and Super 8 reels, fantastic. Give your nan a high five. But if you aren't lucky enough to have a trove of old footage in your home, the internet is here for you. Archive.org has a whole library of home videos and archived news footage which you can watch to your heart's content. I'll link some of my favorite collections in that database, which you can explore at your leisure. These videos show what people just happened to be wearing when someone turned on a home movie camera. Sometimes they're special occasions, but sometimes it's just whenever Dad decided to bother everybody. Either way, this is a candid time capsule that is delightful to see. Next day, I cut off any extra dry glue and polished up the edges. Then I busted out my paints. This paint I'm using is made for block printing on textiles, but for our Halloween video in 2020, my spouse and I experimented successfully with regular block printing ink on silk. You do you. When choosing your paints or inks, consider whether or not this garment will be washed. Also, think about how much you don't want to clean up any transfers, bleeding, or spills. Make sure to do a few test swatches to see if that's a reality you'll be facing. The roller distributes the paint more evenly, whereas if you took the stamp directly to the paint, you'd end up with blobs and empty bits. Fun fact, in the Sanganeri printing tradition, they press the stamp into a dye-saturated cloth which is pulled taut in a small frame. This achieves a similar even distribution of dye. The stamp is then pressed into the fabric. And lather, rinse, repeat. I wasn't concerned with keeping the stamp exactly straight, nor did it bother me when the table leaves were a little uneven and there would be small gaps in the print, but I tried to keep the pattern roughly consistent-ish. I had traced where the pieces of my gown were going to be. I wanted to make sure that the stamps were all oriented in the same direction. I chose to use this as an opportunity to lean a little harder into the heraldic look that I mentioned earlier. This could look great or awful, and we will have to see when the paint dries. Books. Okay, yes, I know. We're supposed to be talking about pictures, and here I am talking about books some more. Stay with me. Along with the V&A books which I had mentioned previously, there was a rage in the Victorian era for reprinting fashion and ornament images into books. The image plate usually provided references, sometimes on the page, sometimes with an index, but sometimes not at all, so beware. The definitive master of this style was Albert Auguste Racinet, who was an illustrator and printer in 19th century France. His book, Le Costume Historique, is one of the first definitive collections of costume history, containing over 500 plates which were copied and compiled from original artworks and artifacts. This is a reprint by the Taschen art book publishing house. This was one of the first books which featured non-European fashion and clothing. That said, those sections are a minefield. Sometimes they state facts, but more often they are stereotyping or outright racism. Approach with caution. Also, the Victorian era was a time that was really into appropriation and renaming designs and styles to distance them from their origins. Try to find sources written by people from that culture when you can. Hannah from Chai and Parche on Instagram often features books about the history of Persian textiles. She identifies which of these books actually focus on the whole history versus only the European history. Worth a follow if only for those excellent recommendations. Reference books for antiques, jewelry, art, and architecture can also be very helpful. A lot of art movements had echoes in fashion and vice versa. The Regency fascination with classical Greece and Rome, for example, or the Victorian preoccupation with medieval and Gothic revival. This knowledge can help you place images you find in time and space. Even if you're less sure about the clothing, the furniture, decor, and architecture can give you clues. Folks, we are getting so close to the end of this project and I am excited! Thanks to my Patreon patrons whose contributions paid for the lino blocks, the paint, and my continued sanity. Follow the link or the card above to become a patron yourself. Make sure to like, subscribe, and check out the other videos in this series, which I've made into a handy-dandy playlist. This paint takes a week to cure before it's safe to wash or wear, so we wait. In the meantime, have a great week, and I'll see you soon.